The week of April 21st to the 27th was a stormy one. The rain only added to the action. Last week, on April 18th, America sent communication to Germany relaying the news of the termination of their neutrality. This added yet another powerful country to this continental war. As more and more countries started entering the war, more casualties kept piling up. This is shown as German deaths in Verdun continued to increase this past week. There were more and more deaths on the naval front as well. Remember the Sussex incident, which caused more than 80 deaths? Well, this past week, President Wilson sent a note to Berlin about the Sussex incident. Germany suffered in this naval conflict, but were boosted yet again when there was a reported unsuccessful Russian offensive. Very few casualties were due to the Tigris floods starting this past week, but will continue to cause more harm in the following weeks. The Eastern Front was silent between April 21st and the 27th, but the Western Front was full of action. First, there was a hand-on-hand fight over control of Mortholme-Crest on April 21st. This was part of the Battle of Verdun, which lasted from February 21st until December 19th, 1916. Mortholme-Crest is a hill, 295 meters, called Le Mortholme. It is on the left riverbank held by the French. It was an important lookout point, but was attacked by the Germans. A French eyewitness recounted, "My battalion comes straight from the land behind the front lines. The men are exhausted and did not sleep. The battalion consists of 800 men. The battalion that we are here to replace lost 800 men." Why was Mortholme-Crest relevant, and why was this part of the Battle of Verdun? The Mortholme-Crest served as a lookout point for the French. Much of the French artillery used in this part of the Battle of Verdun was positioned here as well. This was part of Phase 3 of the Battle of Verdun. As frightening as the artillery in Mortholme-Crest was, the Germans opening an assault with a chlorine gas attack in the Second Battle of Ypres, which was the first successful use of poison gas on the Western Front, and which was much more terrifying. This left more than 10,000 casualties of the Allies, over half of whom died. One eyewitness recounted, "There's a sort of greenish-yellow cloud rolling along the ground out in front. It's coming." This was a new and horrific event. But what went on in the Battle of Ypres? The Germans first arrived in Ypres at the beginning of the World War. Later on, the French and British came to meet them. Recall back to October, when the first fighting started in Ypres. So far, the German armies have not been able to capture Ypres. Even though Russia was not moving men towards Ypres, Russia moved towards Verdun to join the French and received an enthusiastic welcome. As the Russians arrived, so did the Germans. On the same day, April 22nd, 30 German divisions, 600,000 men, had appeared on the Verdun front. Troops were not only on the move towards Verdun, but the British were trying to move past the floods they encountered in Tigris this past week. On April 22nd, there were continuing floods in the Tigris region, which were proving to be an obstacle for the advance of the British. This favored the Germans greatly. What is the significance of these floods? The floods hindered the British moving forward. The next 2 days were virtually silent on the Western Front. But on April 26th, the French aeroplanes fight the Zeppelin, a type of rigid airship named after German Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin. Over Zeenberg, a village on the coast of Belgium, it came out for the third successive night in a row, the Zeppelins were engaged in a rare air raid on England. As the Germans were closing in on the British, the Germans were also closing in on the Swiss frontier. The Swiss usually stayed out of this continental war, but the Germans were still making sure they weren't getting involved. Another possible attack presented itself. There was also movement on the Lorraine border and in Vosges, showing a new possible attack by the Teuton forces on the French lines in Verdun. More shifts were still happening. The next day, on April 27th, there was a great increase in the German activity on the British front in Belgium. As more and more troops shifted their positions and added more troops to the war, there was a severe loss in communication. But one triumph in this need for communication was when French and Britain sent official communication, which is the longest sent message from any army headquarters during this war. It describes the operations on the British front, where it was predicted that the Germans were about to launch another attack in Verdun. What will happen next? On April 22nd and 23rd, there were clashing movements towards peace and rebellion. There was an outburst for peace in Hungary, while Dublin exploded in an Easter rebellion. This was an armed rebellion by the Irish against the British. The rising was launched by Irish Republicans to end British rule in Ireland and make an independent Irish Republic. This was ideal timing because the United Kingdom was engaged in World War I. It took British troops a week to calm down the rebellion. Irish citizens at this time said, "This war appears to me as the most fearful crime of centuries. In it is the working class are to be sacrificed, that a small clique of rulers and arrangement makers stay safe and for their lust for power and their greed for wealth. Nations are to be obliterated, progress stopped, and international hatreds erected into deities to be worshipped. And you cannot conquer Ireland. You cannot extinguish the Irish passion for freedom. If our deed has not been sufficient to win freedom, then our children will win it by a better deed." You can see how enraged the Irish were. This conflict continued on to April 24th, Easter Monday, when in Dublin the Irish Republican Brotherhood launched a new wave of the Easter Rebellion. A few days later, on April 27th, Romania declared war on Austria-Hungary, formally entering World War I. King Ferdinand of Russia addressed the army saying, "I have summoned you to fight side by side with the men of the great nations to which we are allied. A desperate struggle awaits you. We shall bear these hardships manfully, and with God's help, victory will be ours." The Romanian troops crossed the border of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire into the much contested province of Transylvania. As the Romanians strike on Austria-Hungary, the British were also fighting for their own people. 3 British officers, including the famous Captain Lawrence, attempt to engineer the escape of thousands of British troops under siege at the city of Kutanama in Mesopotamia through a secret negotiation with the Turkish command. The southern front was relatively quiet this week, but throughout this week, the Russians and the Turks continued their war in the Caucasus and around the Black Sea, but had no new movements or changes in this conflict. The Russians just continued to push on from Trebizond. The Russians triumphed as they continued to chase the retreating Turks and defeat all their attempts to make a stand. The naval strikes during this week were present, but I still wouldn't call them exciting. On April 25th, German warships and zeppelins attacked the east coast of England early in the day, but were driven off by a brief engagement by British warships and airplanes. Only 1 English air pilot was wounded, and another went missing, which was the least of Britain's worries. Yet, later on in the week, Britain took another hit. A British destroyer was badly damaged by German naval forces, and an auxiliary steamer was sunk, and the crew was captured. But the British were not only suffering. They took 2 towns, Umbugwe and Salgana, in German East Africa on April 22nd. Yet on April 24th, Britain was happy with their naval result. A German ship that had been attempting to land in Ireland was sunk. In the next week, the submarine crisis will become worse. Relations between Germany and the US ambassador will go downhill. There will be another wave of Irish nationalist conflicts. The Easter Rising movement will continue to create more casualties. Even more casualties will continue to die as the Romanian troops open a new front of the war in Transylvania. The Kaiser's reaction to this will be frantic, yet he regained perspective by replacing Erich von Falkenhayn with Paul von Hindenburg as the Chief of General Staff on August 28th. Will these issues be resolved soon? I think not.